Sun's up, quiet morning, nothing dramatic happening out here yet, which is actually a decent place to start this one from, because this chapter is less about a single explosive moment and more about something built slowly, layer by layer, over a long stretch of repeated difficulty. The chapter is called Armor Mind, and the central image it offers is a simple one, borrowed from something physical almost everyone has experienced directly: a callus. Skin exposed repeatedly to friction doesn't stay soft and vulnerable. It thickens, adapts, becomes harder to damage the same way it used to be damaged. The book's argument is that the mind works the same way. That mental toughness isn't something a person is simply born with or without. It's something built deliberately through repeated, voluntary exposure to exactly the kind of discomfort that would otherwise feel unbearable. This chapter picks up during a stretch of training that included a genuine, forced setback, an illness serious enough to require actually restarting part of the process from the beginning, rather than continuing forward. Doctors sidelined him for a real medical reason, not an excuse, not a choice, an actual physical necessity. And the response to that setback is where I think this chapter earns its place in this series. The restart didn't get treated as a defeat. It got treated as more reps, another lap through exactly the kind of controlled difficulty that builds the callus this whole chapter is describing. I want to spend this whole episode on that reframe, because I think it's genuinely different from anything covered in the previous 4 chapters of this book, even though it rhymes with several of them. The last episode was about converting suffering into structured fuel in the moment, a scoreboard for a specific hard mile. This chapter is about something slower and more foundational, building the actual capacity to handle difficulty at all, deliberately, over time, the same way a callus doesn't form from a single day of friction, but from repeated exposure sustained long enough for the tissue underneath to actually change. It's worth naming why this particular metaphor, out of everything the book could have reached for, actually holds up under scrutiny rather than just sounding poetic. A callus isn't magic. It's a specific, well-understood biological response to repeated, subinjurious stress, exactly enough friction to trigger adaptation, not so much that the tissue actually tears. Too little friction and nothing changes. Too much, applied all at once, just causes damage rather than adaptation. The mind, according to this chapter, needs the same calibrated middle ground. Here's the core claim worth sitting with directly. Mental toughness isn't a fixed trait some people have and others lack. It's closer to a physical adaptation, built through the same basic mechanism any other adaptation gets built through: controlled, repeated exposure to a stress just large enough to demand a response, followed by enough recovery to actually integrate that response before the next exposure. Asterisk, asterisk, that's not a metaphor stretch to fit a convenient narrative. It's close to literally how physical training works too, and this chapter's real insight is noticing that the same underlying mechanism applies to the mind's relationship with discomfort just as much as it applies to a muscle's relationship with load. This matters enormously for how the setback in this chapter actually got used. A forced restart from the outside looks like lost time, wasted effort, a step backward in a process supposedly measured by forward progress. From the inside, treated the way this chapter describes, it's simply another rep, another cycle of controlled exposure to exactly the kind of demand that builds the callus in the first place. The armor doesn't care whether a given rep happens on schedule or gets repeated because of an unplanned setback. It only cares whether the exposure actually happened consistently enough times for the adaptation to take hold. Asterisk, asterisk. I want to bring this down into something specific and personal, because the abstract version of seek discomfort deliberately can sound like empty motivational language without something concrete attached to it. For a long stretch, my own training avoided a specific kind of discomfort almost entirely, not through any conscious decision, just through the quiet, comfortable drift toward whatever felt easiest to manage. Running in genuinely unpleasant weather, cold rain, real wind, conditions that weren't dangerous, just unpleasant, got avoided reliably, rescheduled for a better day whenever one was available. That avoidance felt entirely reasonable at the time, the same way most avoidance does. It also meant a specific kind of mental callus, the one built by choosing to move through discomfort that offers no real physical risk, simply never got the chance to form. I remember noticing this pattern clearly for the first time on a morning I'd rescheduled a run 3 separate times in the same week, each time for a genuinely plausible reason. Rain, then a slightly colder morning than forecast, then a vague sense of not feeling quite up for it. None of those 3 reasons, examined individually, was dishonest exactly. Stacked together, they revealed something this chapter names directly. A mind that had quietly arranged its entire relationship with discomfort around avoiding it whenever a reasonable sounding excuse was available, which meant the specific capacity to move through unpleasant but safe conditions had simply never been asked to develop. I started deliberately choosing the unpleasant conditions instead of waiting for them to be unavoidable. Not because the run itself needed to happen in the rain specifically, but because the choice to move through unnecessary discomfort on purpose, repeated enough times, was itself the actual point. The first several times felt exactly as unpleasant as expected, cold, uncomfortable, nothing redeeming about the experience in the moment. What changed gradually over roughly 2 months of doing this once or twice a week wasn't the discomfort itself. The rain was still cold every single time. What changed was the mind relationship to that discomfort, the automatic, reflexive resistance that used to show up at the first sign of unpleasant conditions getting noticeably quieter, replaced by something closer to simple acceptance that this was just what today's run happened to involve. That shift, once it actually showed up, extended well past weather, which is really the whole point this chapter is making. A callus built in one specific area of controlled discomfort doesn't stay confined to that one area. It generalizes quietly to other kinds of difficulty the mind encounters because the underlying capacity being built isn't tolerance for rain specifically, it's tolerance for discomfort itself as a category, regardless of its particular flavor. Asterisk, a harder conversation at work, a difficult decision that used to feel paralyzing, started meeting a mind slightly less reflexively resistant than it used to be, not because those situations had anything literally to do with running in the rain, but because the underlying muscle, so to speak, had actually been worked. I want to be careful about not overstating that generalization. It wasn't a sudden transformation into someone unbothered by difficulty in general. It was a small, specific shift, noticeable mostly in retrospect, a slightly shorter gap between encountering something unpleasant and actually moving through it across several unrelated areas of life. I want to walk through the restart as reps idea more directly because it's the piece of this chapter most directly relevant to anyone who's dealt with a real injury, which given this channel's whole history is probably most people listening. There's a version of this that risks sounding like it's arguing against ever resting or respecting a genuine setback. And I want to head that off clearly before going any further, because that's not actually what this chapter, or the book's own story, is describing. The illness that forced that training restart wasn't pushed through. It was treated by doctors, respected as the real, physical event it was, and only once actually recovered did the retraining begin. The reframe isn't ignore the setback and keep going regardless. It's once the necessary recovery has genuinely happened, treat the restart itself as additional reps rather than as evidence the whole effort was doomed. I've had my own version of this, distinct from any story covered in earlier episodes, worth walking through honestly. A stretch of forced rest following a flare-up in an old injury. Several weeks where training had to stop completely, not as a choice, but as a medical necessity, was followed by a restart that initially felt, emotionally, like starting over from nothing, as if the weeks and months of progress before the injury had simply been erased. That feeling, looked at honestly through this chapter's lens, was almost entirely wrong. The capacity built before the injury hadn't actually disappeared. What had happened was closer to an unplanned rep in the ongoing process of building resilience. An unwelcome one, but a rep nonetheless. One that added its own specific kind of callus. The capacity to recover from a real setback and restart without treating the restart as a verdict on the whole project. Asterisk, asterisk. I remember the specific morning that restart actually began, standing at the door with noticeably less confidence than any ordinary morning covered in earlier episodes, genuinely unsure whether the fitness built before the injury had survived the weeks off at all. The honest answer, once the first few runs actually happened, was that some of it clearly hadn't. The pace felt harder than it should have. The effort required for a previously comfortable distance was noticeably higher. That was real, physical fact, not something to argue with. What this chapter's reframe actually changed wasn't the physical reality of the setback. It changed what that reality meant emotionally, converting, "I've lost everything I built," into "this specific restart is now part of what I've built," which turned out to be a meaningfully different, more accurate, and considerably more sustainable way to hold the same set of facts. That reframe changed the emotional shape of the restart significantly once it actually landed. Instead of grieving the lost weeks as pure loss, the restart itself became something closer to what this chapter describes: a specific, difficult rep in the larger process of building an armored mind. One that happened to focus on resilience after setback rather than tolerance for unpleasant weather. Every restart forced by a genuine, respected injury adds a specific kind of toughness that a smooth, uninterrupted training history never gets the chance to build. The capacity to come back rather than simply the capacity to continue uninterrupted. That's not a consolation prize invented to make an unwanted setback feel better. It's a genuinely real, specific adaptation, distinct from the kind built through uninterrupted consistency and a training history with a few real, respected restarts, and it isn't necessarily a worse history than one without them. Just a history that's built a different specific kind of resilience. There's a boundary worth being extremely precise about here, because this entire chapter walks a genuinely difficult line, and getting it wrong in either direction causes real problems. Deliberately seeking manageable, voluntary discomfort to build a callus is not the same as ignoring a genuine signal that something is actually wrong, and treating a real injury as just another rep to push through is exactly the kind of misapplication that turns a genuinely useful idea into something dangerous. The illness in this book's own story was respected, not overridden. The distinction this whole chapter depends on is the same one covered a couple episodes back. Voluntary, controlled discomfort with no real physical risk, cold rain, an uncomfortable but safe pace builds the callus this chapter describes. A genuine injury signal, sharp pain, a symptom that's specific and worsening rather than just unpleasant, calls for exactly the kind of respect the book's own story shows it receiving: real rest, real medical attention, followed by a restart only once actually ready. I want to add one more layer to that boundary, because it's easy to blur once emotional determination gets involved. The test isn't whether something feels hard. Nearly everything this chapter describes fell hard. That's the entire point. The test is whether the difficulty is the kind that builds capacity through manageable, repeatable exposure, or the kind that actually damages tissue that needs to heal before it can be exposed to anything at all. Cold rain, run after run, builds a callus without damaging anything. A joint pushed through a genuine inflammation doesn't build a callus. It just gets more damaged, and calling that process armor is a category error this chapter's own story, with its respected medical setback, was actually careful never to make. I think it's worth being even more concrete about how to actually apply that test in a moment of real uncertainty. Because is this productive difficulty or actual damage can be a genuinely hard question to answer honestly while standing in the middle of a run. A rough, practical version of the test. Does the sensation stay roughly the same or improve slightly as the effort continues, the way ordinary discomfort from cold or fatigue typically does? Or does it get specifically worse, sharper, more localized, the longer the effort continues? The first pattern is usually the safe kind of discomfort this chapter is describing. The second pattern is usually the kind that deserves the same respect the book's own illness received, stopping, resting, and only resuming once genuinely recovered. There's a second, slightly slower version of the same test worth keeping in reserve for situations where the in-the-moment read isn't clear enough to trust. How the body feels the following morning, once a full night's rest has settled things. Ordinary, productive discomfort typically fades substantially overnight, replaced by normal, generalized fatigue rather than anything sharp or localized. Real damage tends to still be there the next morning, often more clearly than during the effort itself. This distinction matters enough to repeat plainly, because the entire value of this chapter collapses if it gets used to justify pushing through real injury signals. The armor this chapter describes was built specifically by respecting the difference between productive discomfort and actual damage. Blurring that line doesn't make someone tougher. It just makes an eventual, more serious injury more likely, which is the opposite of what a callus is actually for. Asterisk, asterisk. I want to walk through what actually applying both halves of this chapter looks like as a practice, because the voluntary discomfort half and the restart as reps half deserve separate, concrete versions. For the voluntary discomfort half, identify one specific, safe kind of discomfort you've been reliably avoiding. Not because it's dangerous, but simply because avoiding it is easier and nothing forces the confrontation. Weather is the obvious one, but it could just as easily be a specific uncomfortable pace, a specific route with more elevation than feels appealing, anything that's genuinely safe but genuinely unpleasant. Choose it deliberately, once or twice a week, not every day, the same measured frequency covered in the last episode's caution about overusing a sharp-edged tool. Notice over roughly 2 months whether the automatic resistance to that specific discomfort actually quiets down, the same way mine did with the rain, and whether that quieting generalizes at all to other kinds of difficulty in life beyond running. I want to be specific about pacing this correctly, because once or twice a week is a deliberate choice, not an arbitrary one. This isn't the daily, high-intensity tool from the last episode, meant for the specific mornings that are already genuinely severe. This is a slower, steadier exposure, closer in spirit to strength training than to an emergency measure, something that works precisely because it's sustainable enough to actually continue for the full 2 months rather than something so intense it burns out within the first 2 weeks. Choosing the harshest possible version of discomfort every single day isn't building a callus faster. It's usually just causing the kind of damage this chapter's own boundary explicitly warns against. For the restart is reps half. The next time a genuine setback forces an actual pause, respect it completely first, exactly the way this chapter's own story respects the illness that caused its restart. Once real recovery has actually happened, before beginning again, name the restart explicitly as a specific kind of rep, one that builds the capacity to come back rather than the capacity for uninterrupted consistency. Write that reframe down somewhere visible if it helps, the same way earlier episodes have suggested writing down a specific number or a specific threshold. The restart isn't evidence the whole project failed. It's a specific, real form of training that a smooth history never gets the chance to include. I want to add one final practical note about the restart specifically, because the first few days back after any real setback tend to be the hardest ones to hold this reframe through. The instinct standing at the door on that first day back is to compare current capacity directly against whatever was right before the setback, which almost always produces a discouraging gap. A more honest comparison, and a considerably kinder one, is against where things stood at the very beginning of this whole project, a year or more ago now for this channel. Measured against that much earlier starting point, a restart after injury usually still represents real, net progress, even accounting for whatever capacity the setback temporarily cost. That wider comparison window is often the difference between a restart that feels like total defeat and one that actually gets held the way this chapter intends. Tomorrow morning, whatever specific discomfort you've been quietly avoiding, and whatever specific setback you're currently recovering from or dreading having to recover from someday, is available as exactly the kind of material this chapter describes, provided the line between manageable and damaging actually gets respected. The armor this chapter is describing was never built by avoiding difficulty. It was never built by ignoring real danger either. It was built by choosing the specific, safe, repeatable difficulty deliberately, and by treating every necessary restart as one more rep in a much longer process than any single week or month was ever going to capture on its own. I want to close this one with a slightly wider thought, because 5 chapters into a new book felt like a reasonable point to step back and notice a pattern across all of them. Every chapter so far has been, underneath its specific language, an argument for the same basic move, converting something that initially looks like pure obstacle, a hard truth, an untested belief, an impossible task, external doubt, a physical setback, into usable material rather than simply enduring it or avoiding it. This chapter's version of that move is maybe the most literal one yet, treating discomfort itself, in its safest and most repeatable form, as the actual raw material out of which resilience gets built, one deliberate rep at a time. Looking back across the last 4 episodes with that pattern in mind, it's a little striking how consistently it shows up, dressed differently each time, but doing roughly the same work. The scale reading in Chapter 1 became the starting material for everything that followed. The untested belief in Chapter 2 became something to experiment on. The impossible task became a structured process, checkpoint by checkpoint. The doubt and past failure from the last episode became fuel for a specific mile. And now discomfort itself becomes the substance the mind gets built out of. Nothing genuinely difficult in this book, so far, has been treated as pure loss. That pattern, once it's visible across 5 chapters instead of just 1, starts to feel less like a series of separate tricks and more like a single underlying stance toward difficulty in general. Nothing genuinely difficult, faced honestly and handled with real judgment about what's actually safe, needs to be pure loss. Almost all of it, examined closely enough, turns out to be material, waiting for someone willing to actually use it as such rather than simply survive it and move on. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice, and whatever specific discomfort today's version of it happens to involve. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.